Welcome to NASA Edge, an inside and outside look at all things NASA. Joining us today is Pat Troutman, who I like to call the lunar architecture guru at NASA Langley Research Center. How you doing, Pat?
Very good, Chris.
Pat, what goes into designing an architecture for the moon?
Well, an architecture is more than just the chess pieces on the board. It's the board and the rules of the board and how you play the game. So it's meeting stakeholders' expectations. In this case, it's the American people, it's the Congress, it's the president, and making sure that we're achieving the goals and objectives that they want to do. Once we've decided what the goals and objectives are, and number one goal right now is get to the moon in 2024, we have to figure out a way now to get the chess pieces that will enable that to happen. So the first part there is, even before we start building, we have to figure out how we're going to partner, how we're going to do it. So we just recently spent 6 months working at procurement of the new human landing system, and they announced 3 partners a week before last. And we're very excited now to move on to that next phase, is where we start actually designing the hardware in earnest based upon our requirements on how we get to the moon. And it's not just physics like repeating Apollo. We have a new set of players, we have a new set of capabilities, we have commercial launches, we have things we didn't have back in the 60s. And we want to go to the moon, but go to the moon to stay and do it sustainably. So we're architecting the lunar campaign a little bit differently, where we have reusable systems and eventually we can take advantage of the researchers on the moon.
So when that first woman sets foot on the lunar surface in 2024, what are we expecting to have on the surface?
So we have a commercial lunar payload service, CLIPS is what we call it for short. And we're expecting actually to have reconnaissance robots there before the crew get there. So when the crew sets down there, when that first woman steps off the lander, she might be greeted by a robot. She might be greeted by a set of pre-placed tools for them to do their mission, so they don't have to carry them from the Earth. She might get greeted by an unpressurized rover. Think of an electric car in the 21st century on the moon. There's a lot of possibilities of what she could be greeted by. What's really interesting is not what she could be greeted by, but where she's going to get greeted by these things. Instead of going to probably the easiest place we go to, which is like we did in Apollo, which was the equator, we're going to the lunar South Pole. The lunar South Pole is important for a myriad of reasons. Number one, it's sort of like the high ground. It's at a point where there's sunlight almost 80% of the year. Sunlight is another version of in situ resource utilization. It's a natural resources we can take advantage of to make our stay there easier and more affordable. Also located in the same place are potentially vast deposits of water ice that we may be able to mine and extract water from, which turns into rocket propellant and water and of course air to breathe. So the where is really exciting because it's like beachfront property on the moon, and that's where we want to go. That's where we want to build Artemis Space Camp.
Now, what kind of team does it take when designing this lunar architecture? Obviously, you have to work with engineers, you have to work with scientists. I'm sure you have to work with many people across the agency. What kind of skill sets are needed to develop a lunar architecture?
Well, that is a really good question because it's not just engineering. I like to say that the engineering part is the easiest part of it. It's the budgets, it's the politics, it's the legalese of claiming a space on a planet that's not Earth. They just recently had something called the Artemis Accords, which lays the groundwork for some of that legal aspects of it. I'm not a lawyer, I can't understand it. It's open to interpretation rather than the laws of physics. So that to me is very challenging. We have to design this system in such a way that it fits into a budget slice. We can't just expect to get everything we need all at once. So we have to phase the development of the lunar systems and the launch vehicles such that we can afford it as we go. And we design it in such a way that it is still affordable 10 years after we first landed that first woman on the moon.
And then, of course, I can imagine when we get back to the lunar surface in 2024, then you have to think about sustainable exploration. What's that architecture going to look like 10, 15, 20 years beyond that point? And then to make things even more challenging, I'm sure you're working on Mars as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we're sort of tying the two together now. Our strategy on the moon is that we're going to go there. We're going to lay claim to the high ground, to the South Pole of the moon. We're also going there to practice what we need to practice for going to Mars. So the high priority of what we're going to do on the moon initially is going to be surface exploration as we would do on the surface of Mars. So our first mission to Mars, we're talking about sending basically just 2 crew to the surface in a mobile habitat, a pressurized rover, for about 30 days, and their job will be to look for signs of extant life and other science objectives. It's sort of like a touch and go to prove we can do it, but also to get to the point where we can establish primary capabilities that can be used to build bigger and better things. That same strategy, we're working backwards to the moon. So the initial lunar missions are first just the testing of the lander system. So that first mission may not be an incredible feat. It might be a few days. It might be touch and go. It might be slide them out EVAs. But that's to test the transportation system, because we're not trying to do it all at once. This is the marathon. Okay, we're going for long, and we're not doing a sprint there. So the next mission, that might be when the unpressurized rover there. And that's going to expand the range, expand the stay capability, allow us to explore and either change sensors on some of those robotic systems, or take that unpressurized rover to places where the robots couldn't go. And we'll learn from that experience. We'll gradually expand our base in distance on the lunar surface and duration on the lunar surface.
So your architecture is always evolving. It's a work in progress. You don't get to a point where you kind of just set the limit and say, okay, this is our architecture, we're going with it. You're making tweaks along the way.
Yeah, I mean, we're under no preset fantasy that what we design today is what we'll actually do 15 years from now. We design it to evolve based upon evolving discoveries. If we find that the water deposits are too hard to mine or require more energy, we'll adjust our strategy to accommodate that. If we find that the rest of the world really wants to build a lunar village there and they want to build that next outpost to humanity, well, maybe Mars might get put off a little bit. Right now, our strategy is go to the moon, test for Mars, lay a foundation so that other people can explore the moon and we can do it, but not take all our resources. So we can take those resources and focus them off to Mars as the next step. And then we go do the same thing at Mars, where we lay a foundation of capabilities, and then we go back and build upon that foundation.
Now, I know you have a pretty challenging job in defining this architecture. Do you ever, you're sleeping at night, you wake up and you have an epiphany and you come up with something and say, look, I found a solution to a certain challenge of this architecture. Does it drive you crazy sometimes at night?
It does, but it's mostly in the shower in the morning. That's the relaxing time where you're thinking your mind is clear and those things come to me. Just like the other day, part of the lunar base is something we call this pressurized rover, but we also want to put down what we call a kilopower nuclear power plant. This is 10 kilowatts of power, because even though there's abundant sunshine at the lunar South Pole, there are periods where there are not. And it's sort of like you would have a constant source and then surges. So they've been treating these things separately, and then I thought, well, why don't we just put the kilopower unit on the back of the rover and land them together, and then the rover can roll off the lander and take the nuclear power unit to where it needs to be, and the people don't have to be involved. It just sort of drops off and goes off. And these are the type of things you get to as you progress through an architecture, where you go step by step by step, and then you find out there's a step D and a step B, and maybe they should go together. And so you're constantly evolving those. And right now, we really don't know exactly what the landing system's going to look like, because we just brought on the 3 contractors to do that. And those landing systems go all the way from 3 feet off the ground to 70 feet off the ground. So it greatly impacts on how you would build your lunar base and how you would deploy and transport things.
Well, Pat, that's why I call you the guru of the lunar architecture. And seeing your work over the past 10, 15 years, even from the old days of Constellation to Artemis, I mean, you are the man when it comes to defining a lunar architecture, and we appreciate all the work that you do. And keep having those great ideas when you're taking showers in the morning.
Well, there's hundreds of other people taking showers too, not at the same time in the same place, but we're all thinking. It's a group effort to put this together. I like to think of myself as one of many orchestra leaders, but it's the beautiful music comes from the musicians themselves. So I'm just trying to make sure it sounds good when it all comes together. But it is definitely a teamwork effort across NASA and across industry to make all this work.
Well, Pat, you have a great shirt on there. I can't bust on your wardrobe. Artemis, Great program. We're looking forward to that first woman landing on the lunar surface in 2024. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure.
You're watching NASA Edge, an inside and outside look at all things NASA.